Welcome, everyone. My name is Sung Lee. I am the chair of the AFT Asian Caucus, a delegate in the New York State United Teachers, and the treasurer of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, as well as the chair of the United Federation of Teachers Asian American Heritage Committee. Want to welcome you today. Tell you that we're happy that it is May, which is Mental Health Awareness Month, Jewish American Heritage Month, but also Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, the reason that we are here today. I'm going to say that I look forward to presenting this information with my colleague, Ms. Mikayla Vu, who is the secretary of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. We are happy that we are the main labor alliance that supports Asian Pacific American workers as part of the American Federation of Labor, the AFL-CIO's affiliate organization. I'm going to start by presenting the land acknowledgement, and then we will hear some words by the Secretary Treasurer of the New York State United Teachers, Mr. Philippe Abraham. We begin by acknowledging that we meet on the traditional land served by the first people. We honor America's indigenous people. We learn from all elders, past, present, and emerging. We are called on to share what we learn about the tribal history, culture, and contributions that have been suppressed in telling the story of America. We invite you to think about the spaces you are inhabiting and the indigenous people who came before them and were stewards of the land. You will also see a link in the chat related to that acknowledgement. I am now going to have Mr. Philippe Abraham speak on behalf of the work that we're doing and that we are proud of as part of the New York State United Teachers. Thank you.
Thank you, Sung, and thank everyone for joining us today as we commemorate Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. This is a moment to honor the histories, cultures, and countless contributions of AAPI communities, not only to our society as a whole, but also to the labor movement and to public education. As Secretary Treasurer, I want to acknowledge that AAPI educators, support staff, and union members have long been part of the fabric of our schools and our unions, often without the recognition they deserve. Whether organizing for better working conditions, advocating for multilingual education, or serving students in diverse and underserved communities, AAPI workers continue to be pillars of strength and leadership. But we also recognize that AAPI educators face unique challenges. Many report being underrepresented in leadership roles, stereotyped as perpetual foreigners, or expected to remain silent in the face of injustice. In our classrooms, AAPI students often don't see themselves reflected in the curriculum, or worse, they are targets of racism and xenophobia, especially during times of geopolitical conflict or public health crises. That is why this month matters. When we lift up AAPI voices, we counter invisibility. When we teach AAPI history, we challenge the harmful myth that Asian Americans are a monolith or that they don't face discrimination. And when we organize for equity in our schools and workplaces, we honor the labor of all those who came before us, including AAPI workers who fought for dignity, fair wages, and respect. Once again, thank you for being here today and for committing to the work of learning, understanding, and co-conspiratorship. Together, we are building a fabric for one of our many threads. Let's continue to build a labor movement and an education system that values every voice and leaves no one behind. With that, I'm going to pass it back to my brother Sung. Sung, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippe. I am now pleased to have Miss Mikayla Vu speak. Mikayla is part of AFT Massachusetts as a representative. She's been successful in negotiating contracts in Massachusetts and is a lovely, amazing artist, seamstress, and does a lot of other amazing work besides. And Mikayla, by all means, please take it away.
Thank you, Sung. I'm really excited to share this presentation tonight that really is about the role of Asian Pacific Islander workers helping build our labor movement. And, our goal today is to share stories about this rich and inspiring legacy and all of the amazing contributions. And I want to give context about the struggles of ANHPI workers, which only emphasizes the extraordinariness of their fight. And I hope at the end you'll think of them when you think of labor movement's shining stars. And as educators, we know that there's the importance of teaching history. And one history that is often forgotten is the history of ANHPI workers in US history and the labor history. Most folks don't ever learn about this history in K through 12, and oftentimes only hear about it in brief tidbits or when they get to college. And so I hope you can all leave here today with a little bit greater understanding of the history of labor is one that includes the actions and leaderships of AAPI workers and union members. And we have a few teaching objectives for this presentation. So one is to provide a brief overview of AAPI labor history. And there are pieces that are not included in this presentation. And there's so many numerous and powerful stories that exist, and this will only cover a few of them. It's also to demonstrate the long history and leadership of AAPI workers fighting to improve their working conditions and their lives through organizing, forming unions, and building multiracial coalitions. To understand key concepts such as nativism, yellow peril, and the model minority myth, and to inspire us to keep fighting and organizing in our workplaces. So just to start, what does AANHPI stand for? What does this mean? So this refers to Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders, and refers to a very diverse community of people and languages across the diaspora of Asia and the Pacific Islands. This area encompasses over 100 languages, dialects, and multiple religions. And we are a multi-generational, recent immigrants, adoptees, biracial, and we are not a monolith. This is an extremely diverse population with diverse experiences and histories in the United States. According to the 2020 census, there are 24 million Asian Americans in the US, an additional 1.5 million who identify as Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. And these people can be people who identify with that term alone or in combination with others. And more than 70% of Asians living in the US are immigrants, and there's large numbers of undocumented immigrants within the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. And of, kind of the population, there are 786,000 API workers who are union members. They work in all sectors, though some of the biggest industries include healthcare, service, and education. And so today, I want to just share some of the stories about important roles played by API union members in the history of the labor movement. But before I can really get into those, they lack full meaning without understanding the context of how these workers came to the US and what work was like for those early immigrants. So, to begin, the story of Asian immigrants coming to the US is not that different from stories of European immigrants. Poverty, disease, and war were often the root cause of people wanting to leave their land and come seek better opportunities for themselves and their family members. And before we get into this, it's important to acknowledge the history of work in the US is anchored by the institution of slavery. For enslaved people, the journey was not about opportunity, but for the enslavers, the practice was about exploitation at all costs in service of greater profits. And that is the common thread that you'll see when it comes to low-skilled immigrants coming to the US. We have documentation of Asian immigration to the US reaching back to 1587, but the first wave of Asian immigrants really didn't start until 1830 when East Asian and Southeast Asian immigrants came to Hawaii to work on the plantations. The plantation owners had created poor working conditions with low wages, unsafe working conditions, and sought to drive wages down by pitting workers against one another. Another larger wave was fueled by turmoil in many Asian countries. China in the mid 1800s faced war and disease outbreaks that drove thousands of Chinese to the shores of the US. And then for Chinese farm workers and farmers, danger and little economic opportunity abounded, and the US seemingly held the answers. So this really contributed to the flow of mostly low-skilled Chinese male workers who came to work in the gold mines and build the Transcontinental Railroad. And similarly, on the eastern shores of the US, immigrants from Ireland, Britain, Norway, Germany, and other European nations were also escaping starvation from crop failures, poverty, and oppression and violence in their homelands. So both of these groups shared similar motivations for coming to the US, but their treatment diverged significantly. So when Asian immigrants first came to the US in relatively small numbers, they were welcomed by pillars of their new communities, including churches and mayors, but that was short-lived. As their numbers grew, they were subject to ugly stereotypes which characterized them as degraded, exotic, disease-ridden, dangerous, and competitors for jobs and wages. Political cartoons of the time depicted Asian workers as a yellow peril. Additionally, nativism was on the rise in America throughout the 1800s as the U.S. experienced increased immigration as well as cycles of economic downturn. Nativism is the policy of protecting the interests of native-born or established inhabitants against those of immigrants. In this time period, nativism meant protecting the interests and rights of U.S. citizens, and more specifically, white Protestant men, against immigrants, including Asian immigrants and Catholic immigrants from Ireland, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe. And I just want to note that the labor movement was front and center in pushing for the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. There were unions such as the Working Men's Party of California, led by Samuel Gompers, who argued that Chinese workers threatened the jobs of white American men. They pushed this narrative of the yellow peril to prevent Chinese immigrants from civic rights, and the racist sentiments of these leaders, was a key component of it, but also the economic upheavals, economic downturns, and rapid industrialization were having significant impacts in changing sectors of the economy. And in this context, the anti-Chinese sentiment and hatred and violence led to the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which remained the first and only major federal legislation to explicitly suspend immigration for a specific nationality. The Basic Exclusion Law prohibited Chinese laborers from entering the country, and there were subsequent amendments that prevented Chinese laborers who had left the U.S. from returning. The passage of the act represented outcomes of years of racial hostility, anti-immigrant agitation by white Americans, and set the precedent for later immigration restrictions against those of other nationalities, and really started a new era in which the U.S. changed from a country that welcomed immigrants to a gatekeeping one. And despite the open hostility from organized labor, Asian workers organized themselves into independent labor organizations that often existed outside the mainstream labor movement. They followed the same principles of strength in numbers and strategized to gain power against the bosses. And while isolated and also often facing racism and anti-union animus from their employers, they nonetheless participated and led numerous strikes of the era, often being the first workers to practice multiracial organizing. And it's really easy to assume that Asian immigrants were rejected, demoralized, fatalistic, seeing no recourse for themselves. But what's incredible about this larger history and this larger legacy is that despite the challenges, despite the laws stacked against them, despite the lack of solidarity, Asian workers started to organize and fight back, often inspiring other workers to do the same. And so now we're going to dive into some of those stories with you to help you see kind of the broader legacy of API workers in the US labor movement. So we would be remiss if we didn't talk about Hawaii and the native Hawaiian sugar plantation workers in the 1840s. So in 1840, Hawaii and the US established formal diplomatic relations and trade treaties. And at this point, Hawaii was still an independent nation. And for context, this is 2 decades before the US Civil War. In 1840, industrial production of sugar began at the Koloa plantation on Kauai, and sugarcane had been a staple crop planted and harvested by native Hawaiians, enjoyed by all the people of Hawaii. But the plantation model required significant manpower to harvest sugarcane on that scale, and there was a short supply of workers on the island. Prior to the plantation system, native Hawaiians had worked only for their chiefs and on a temporary basis known as a labor tax. Native Hawaiians struggled to adjust to the extremely laborious and intensive 10 to 12-hour days of clearing the land, digging irrigation ditches, planting, fertilizing, weeding, and harvesting the sugarcane. They were paid in script, a form of credit instead of cash that they could only spend at the plantation store. In 1841, the native Hawaiian workers had enough, walked off their jobs in the first recorded Hawaiian strike. While they were not organized in a union, they understood the power of standing together and stayed out on strike for 8 days to get a pay increase. The native Hawaiians showed the plantation owners that they would not endure such deplorable working conditions, and due to the fear of continued organizing among the native Hawaiian workforce, sugar planters turned to recruit workers across Asia, Mexico, and the Caribbean to work on the plantations. The strike of 1841 would simply be the first of many strikes of sugar plantation workers in Hawaii, fighting against exploitation by U.S. sugarcane plantation owners. And now shifting to 1867 and the American West. At this time, there was no Wagner Act, there was no protected right to organize. Companies and governments colluded to fight against workers. And despite this, a group of 5,000 Chinese railroad workers organized and staged a strike. Here's the background. Thousands of Chinese workers immigrated to the US to work on the first transcontinental railroad. The Central Pacific Railroad Company recruited Chinese workers to build the railroad in order to fill a labor shortage and ensure they could complete the railroad on time. There's an estimate that the company employed more than 10,000 Chinese laborers to construct the railroad between Sacramento, California, and Promontory, Utah. These Chinese workers faced dangerous conditions, impossible hours, and were paid less than half the wages of white railroad workers. In addition, Chinese workers had to cover the cost of their food. The conditions were so dangerous that it's estimated over 1,000 Chinese workers were killed working on the railroad, meaning approximately every 1 in Chinese workers were killed at work. Despite growing hostility faced by Asian immigrants and no firm footing of protected rights, these workers began a strike on June 24, 1867. A few days earlier, a massive tunnel explosion killed 1 white worker and 5 Chinese workers. They organized 5,000 Chinese workers spanning over 30 miles of track in the Sierra Nevada mountains into a strike. Their demands included wages equivalent to their white counterparts and shorter hours, especially in the cramped, dangerous tunnels. The nonviolent strike posed a lethal threat to the completion of the railroad, but the railroad retaliated by cutting off all provisions to the Chinese workers. After 8 days, the strike ended without any of their demands having been met, but still the strike was not a failure. The workers showed that they could not be taken for granted and would see their conditions improve over time due to continued organizing. Their protests also challenged the prevailing racial stereotype of Chinese as passive, obedient, and without personhood, and it was the largest labor strike of the era, and no doubt also reminded all workers of the power of standing together against oppression. And this was decades before the Homestead strike and the Pullman strike, an extraordinary feat given the rarity of strikes at that time. And the photo shown is not from the strike, but is from the period showing railroad workers leaving a funeral of a Chinese coworker. There's sadly no photos from the strike, but their story continues to endure. And we're going to fast forward 36 more years. So it's 1903, and Japanese and Mexican sugar beet workers in Oxnard, California, have founded the Japanese Mexican Labor Association known as the JMLA. The American Beet Sugar Company was trying to monopolize the market to drive down wages of sugar beet workers and had managed to reduce wages from $5 an acre to as low as $3.75 an acre. They also had stopped paying laborers in cash and instead paid them in store credit that could only be used at a select few stores. 500 Japanese laborers and 200 Mexican laborers came together to form the JMLA to combat the company's tactics. All meetings were held in Japanese and Spanish, and they elected leadership from both sides. They knew that their fate were tied together, and liberation and success could only be achieved through solidarity. And the Oxnard strike of 1903 united 90% of sugar beet workers together against the American Beet Sugar Company. Several weeks into the strike breakers shot 5 strikers and killed one. The press portrayed the strikers as violent, and public opinion was staunchly against them. Despite this, they knew they controlled the means of production, and they eventually won several of their demands, including returning to $5 an acre for beet thinning. But that's not the end of the story. Following the success of their strike, the JMLA became the Sugar Beet Farm Laborers Union, and they sought a charter from the American Federation of Labor, which was granted on the condition that they remove all Asian members. The union refused, writing to AFL President Samuel Gompers, and pushed back and said that, we would be false to ourselves and the cause of unionism if we accepted the privileges for ourselves but denied it to them. And they stood in solidarity with their Japanese colleagues and didn't refuse to accept the charter. The charter then was not granted, and eventually the SBFLU would disband. And another really powerful story is one from an AAPI labor hero from AFT, Sue Kunitomi Embre, who fought for the inclusion of AAPI curriculum in education. And to understand her passion for this fight, we need to understand the impact that internment had on her and her family. Sue was born in 1923 and grew up in Little Tokyo neighborhood of Los Angeles. She dreamed of becoming a teacher because there weren't any Japanese American teachers. And after finishing high school, she postponed attending college to help support her family. She was working in her mother's store when news of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor came over the radio on December 7th, 1941. Due to racism and fear that Japanese Americans were loyal to the Japanese emperor and a perceived threat to national security, President FDR issued Executive Order 9066, ordering the forcible relocation and internment of over 100,000 individuals of Japanese descent. Approximately 2/3 of Japanese Americans incarcerated were U.S. citizens. In 1942, Embre's family would sell their family store at a loss, and at the age of 19, she arrived in Manzanar with her mother and siblings. At the internment camp, she worked at the camp's factory, making camouflage nets for the war, and would later take a job as a reporter with the Manzanar Free Press. In 1943, she was authorized to leave Manzanar and moved to Wisconsin with the hopes of attending the University of Wisconsin. But she was denied entrance and was told that a Japanese American on campus would endanger a war-related project taking place at the school. She would eventually return to LA in 1948 to care for her mother, and with the support of her husband, she began attending California State University part-time and would graduate in 1969. While at California State University, she organized with other students to fight for the inclusion of ethnic studies as part of the Third World Strike of 1968 to 1969. She went on to receive her master's in education from the University of Southern California. In 1972, at 49 years old, she made her dream of becoming a teacher a reality and began teaching at the Los Angeles Unified School District. As a member of United Teachers Los Angeles, UTLA, Embry worked for 10 years in the district, and she fought to include the history of Japanese American incarceration and AAPI history in the curriculum. She worked with her union to organize workshops to provide teachers with lesson plans on how to teach AAPI history. And she knew the importance of teaching that history so students knew the tragedy of incarceration and internment and to ensure that this never happens again. In addition to her union activism, she co-founded the Manzanar Committee and organized annual privileges to Manzanar to raise consciousness about the violation of Japanese Americans during World War II and help propel a national movement for redress and reparations. Her legacy continues at UTLA with API leaders such as Grace Now, Arlene Inoue, Emily Reyes, continuing the fight for racial, educational, and social justice. And in 2023, Asian American Studies was implemented at LA Unified School District, and California legislation was passed requiring ethnic studies to be taught by 2025. The fight for teaching AAPI curriculum has seen recent successes, with states like Illinois, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New York passing legislation around teaching of ethnic studies, but there's more organizing to see that all schools include AAPI curriculum. And our last story for tonight is looking forward to 1982. E.T. was in theaters, Michael Jackson released Thriller, and Ronald Reagan was president. It had been a year since Reagan fired air traffic controllers, releasing a new era of government-sponsored union busting. In New York City's Chinatown, there were approximately 500 government factories employing 20,000 ILGWU Local 2325 members in 1982. Most were immigrant women from Hong Kong and southern China. They worked in hazardous working conditions with long hours and poor pay. They were paid based on piecework rather than the 1981 minimum wage of $3.35 an hour. And in that year, Chinatown garment factories rejected the contract negotiated by the group representing their interests and instead presented their own list of demands. The companies maintained that the union, not the contractors, should provide holiday pay, overtime should be calculated on a weekly rather than a daily basis, and contractors should be free to do business with non-union manufacturers if union work was not immediately available. The union and the Chinese contractors launched competing propaganda campaigns to win over the workers. Chinese employers try to play on workers' ethnic loyalties to get them to side against the white-dominated union. But ultimately, the workers chose their union. Thousands of union members formed a committee to defend the union contract. Volunteering after work and on weekends, they took their messaging to the streets, factory floors, hand billing and phone banking, and telling their story to the media. On June 24th, 1982, nearly 20,000 garment workers rallied in Columbus Park carrying banners and picket signs. Workers chanted, "We are one," as thousands upon thousands of Chinese immigrant women came together to stand up for themselves. Within a few days, all but a few dozen of the Chinatown contractors had pledged to sign the union contract. To persuade the rest, the union organized a second rally on June 29th and warned that after the rally they would strike any contractor who had not signed the pledge. The second rally attracted as large a crowd as the first, and within hours all the contractors had signed the pledge, and the strike ended in a victory for the union. This is a profound story about women, immigrants, and the power to organize against the boss. This was in an era where labor had suffered a tremendous defeat, and the specter of offshoring jobs was becoming more and more real each day. Their strength, courage, and moxie showed all workers what was possible when they stood together. And now transitioning kind of to today, in the modern era, APALA has been one of the groups that has been committed to building multiracial unity to oppose racism, hate, and create a stronger labor movement. as I said earlier, these are just a fraction of the stories of AAPI workers, and they stood up against all odds, and they figured out how to organize, build multiracial coalitions, and fight, and their victory strengthened all workers and inspired new generations of AAPI workers to join the labor movement. And it was the legacy and the leadership of these AAPI workers that led to the formation of APALA in 1992. At the founding convention, over 500 union members gathered in Washington, D.C. to celebrate the past and plan for the future. They took stock of the great history and laid out a clear mission to promote political education and voter registration programs among AAPIs and to the training, empowerment, and leadership of AAPIs within the labor movement and the community. APALA works to defend and advocate for civil and human rights of AAPIs, immigrants, and all people of color, and continues to develop ties within international labor organizations, especially in the Asia-Pacific Rim. And at the founding convention, delegates marched on the U.S. Justice Department demanding justice for Rodney King and a federal civil rights prosecution of the police involved in the beating. This highlights APALA's ongoing commitment to forge multiracial alliance for civil rights, which started at its founding. And today, APALA has 22 chapters across the country and in Hawaii, and we are planning for our 2025 18th biennial convention, where AAPI leaders and allies from across the country will convene to learn about how we can fight back in this current moment. And I just want to take a brief moment just to highlight some of the AFT leaders building the labor movement and building leadership in APALA and their union. So we talked about Sue Embray a little earlier, but I would be remiss to talk about Kent Wong, who was the founding president of APALA and was instrumental in the formation to APALA as an organization. He currently teaches courses in labor studies and Asian American studies at UCLA, and is a member of UCAFT LA, the APALA LA chapter. Additionally, we have Marion Tom, who I know passed away this past year, but she, I think some of you may know her, was a retired bilingual paraprofessional and UFT member who worked in the New York City public schools in Chinatown for over 36 years. And she helped organize paras into UFT and has been active in her union since the 1970s. She not only helped found APALA, but she served as a national officer and a national executive board member of APALA over the years, and has also chaired UFT's Asian American Heritage Committee. There's more that we could get into, and I'm sure you may recognize some of these names, and it's really exciting to see that the legacy of continuing to fight to improve the lives of workers, as well as improving our communities, lives on within the AFT world. And I wouldn't be a good organizer if I didn't come away with an ask. So I am asking you to join APALA. And here are just a few reasons why you should become a member of APALA. So you can connect with the AAPI labor movement and find community with other trade unionists and workers seeking to form their own unions. And you'll see AAPI representation across rank and file members, elected leaders, and staff members. You can be connected to a chapter in your area, such as the APALA New York chapter, that will connect you with campaigns and activities in your area. And through APALA, you will be empowering working families in the labor movement, as well as many of our community allies. You can help develop and grow API labor union members, including the leadership of young workers, and can aid in the education around API union history. And with that, I will end there, and I think we have some time for questions.
So the first question I'm going to ask you is, what impact has the model minority myth had on solidarity between AAPI communities and other communities of color?
Yeah, so I'll start by just answering what is the model minority myth. So this is the myth that Asian Americans are a model minority, that they themselves are successful, well-adjusted, and they don't really need social or economic assistance. And this was really created to sow division between racial minority groups in the US, especially against Black Americans. And it was used to show that other minority groups can achieve success through hard work, and that discrimination and systemic barriers shouldn't impede upward mobility. And so, um, from my experience and in the research, it has had an impact in building, solidarity across communities of color. But when it really gets down to it, the work of the labor movement has been so crucial in helping workers, understand that this is a myth and understand that, we are stronger together. Our enemy is not the worker working alongside or aside from us, but is really, what can we do to take on the boss? What can we do to improve our lives, our working conditions? And so I've actually seen unions being one of the key drivers of breaking down the model minority myth by bringing workers across racial lines together and supporting the broader communities.
I frequently like to chime in here that we have to remember that AAPIs are a relatively recent immigrant group in the United States. Not that there were not generations of people who were born and raised in the United States, but rather in the 70s and 80s and 90s, you had a large population of highly educated AAPI workers who were then basically encouraged to bring forth that to their children and possibly grandchildren. And so it is a misperception that frequently is brought on. And that first, you have to remember that populations were excluded from coming to the United States. And then second, it was easy post civil rights to say, what civil rights? You don't need that. Look at this successful population of pre-selected immigrants who came over who are hugely successful. You just need to be like them. Hitting one group against another has been the hallmark of several groups, administrations, whatever you want to say. And the only way I've found to try to reconcile that is by working with other groups, including LACLA, including CLU, other AFL-CIO affiliate organizations, to try to make sure that we're working together to make sure that the world is a more equitable place.
Yeah, and I'll just add that the model minority myth also erases the differences within the broader community of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders. There's real diversity, and many groups are facing discrimination and poverty and are not as well paid or as well educated as this myth suggests or perpetuates. I'm actually going to turn the script and ask Sung a question. What strategies have you found in building multiracial coalitions or solidarity across communities?
So I'm fortunate enough to be married to a card-carrying LACLA member, and I'm one myself. And that's the Latino Council for Latin Advancement. And say that one of the important things that I found is that our experiences are not the same, but the similarities do matter. And pointing out that having difficulties related to language access, having difficulties related to challenges related to making sure that education does meet the specific needs of our populations is important. And I'm going to say that it has been super helpful in talking about our commonalities and shared experiences in that one way or in different ways, especially when it results in making sure that education schools specifically meet the needs of the diverse students that are coming in. Mikayla, I'm going to flip it back to you. How does the struggle of AAPI workers connect with today's fight for economic justice today?
Yeah, I think this is a great question because even in that presentation, I kept thinking to myself, a lot of things haven't changed. Some of the arguments of why immigrants are harmful to our society that we're experiencing today, or, the continued anti-Asianist, in particular, anti-Chinese rhetoric that we're seeing that has led to a rise in violence against Asian workers in the US. And so, in a lot of ways, this struggle over this long history is directly tied to today. And I think, you know, it may feel a little demoralizing to see that things haven't changed that much, and that there are these kind of constant themes of, you know, businesses trying to, make as much profit and exploit and, really have workers take the brunt of it and not share in that prosperity. But at the same time, I'm often inspired by what our predecessors faced, because they showed that in an era where people weren't as connected, there wasn't this same level of awareness around unions or even support for unions, that they were able to come together and win. And so I take that with me kind of in the future to just show that, like, it has been done before. We can continue to do this, and that, we can win. And I think that hope and that inspiration is really important, because I know right now a lot of us probably feel tired, we might be feeling a little discouraged, but it's more important now than ever for us to come together and fight to improve the lives of not only ourselves, but our students, our communities, and for all workers, both here in the US and across the world.
With that, I want to thank you for coming to this presentation of AAPI labor history and AAPI history as part of the Many Threads, One Fabric series. And I want to thank the New York State United Teachers for having us present here today. Appreciate it.